Hello, I'm Robert, voluntary fact check and helping you if you're scared of many things. And this is about, it's something that I have to say this is my own work, so my own interpolations, because I don't see anyone at the moment talking about how they would police, how the ceasefire would be enforced in any detail. Now, it's very possible that it's incredibly likely, I think you could be certain that this is being talked about secretly between Ukraine and its allies, but it's not been talked about publicly as far as I can see yet. So this is about how, first of all, this is a recent development. Let's look at that, enlarge that. So it's now almost impossible for either side to get past the drone patrols. So these drones, go back to 2022, there weren't any drones. In 2023, most of 2023, there were hardly any drones. There were just drones that were used to drop mines, and mine clearance robots. Go to end of 2023 and into 2024, and that's when the drones started appearing along the battlefield. And then these drones have got more and more capable, more and more sophisticated, and they're now able to, and they're just, I'm not talking about the big drones, which they've always had, but the little ones that are just, that you could hold in your hands, and very much like the ones that they use for when people take photographs of, you can buy an observation drone to fly around and take photographs of your neighborhood or whatever. Then those sort of drones, but equipped with a grenade or equipped with a machine gun, or equipped with various other things, and a little bit more heavy duty, and equipped with enough explosive to cause serious damage and to actually destroy a tank or destroy an infantry fighting vehicle if they hit a vulnerable spot, which they can do because they're very precise. So now that they've got these drones, and they're actually producing millions on either side. So gradually over time, first of all, you got people, they stopped using the infantry fighting vehicles, they stopped using tanks because they just got blown up. So those got impossible, I think, about the turn of this year, end of last year. Then you had people going through on bicycles and on motorbikes, and just finding ways to try to outpace the drones. They can't outpace them anymore because the drones are very fast, and they can easily keep up with the motorbike. So there's what has eventually happened, and there are now so many of them, they're everywhere. And so now it's got to the point where on the front line, you just don't have any soldiers on the front line anymore, hardly any. And the ones that you just get a few observation posts, and the observation post must be invisible to drones. So if a drone flies over you, it mustn't see you, or else you'd soon be killed. And so you've got to be hidden away, you're in rubble of a building or in amongst trees or something, and then you've got to, if you've got a trench, it's got to be a proper tunnel rather than just an open trench, and it's got to be hidden away and with the entrance concealed so that even a drone flying past can't see that that's where you are. And then what's their purpose there? Because as soon as, if they actually stand up and fire, or they try and fire at someone, then they'll be immediately detected and then they'll be killed. So the frontline soldiers are no longer there to actually fight. They're just there to observe. And that's what the geeks are saying is what the front line is like now. And so you have literally no man's land, where nobody can actually live there, even for a short while. And then further back from it, you have apart from a few soldiers, very hard, brave soldiers in these outposts, and they're there to keep an eye out, to look out for soldiers trying to sneak through. And then you have all these drones flying past, and back and forth all the time. And this is why Ukraine has really done no advances for a long time, not very much, but we have advances for a long time. And Russia is advancing, but the way it advances now, and it's got to the point in just the last few weeks where they used to go, normally be a group of 3, with one of them a sniper and then another couple of specialities. I'm not sure what the ratio is, but what it is. But they normally would go in 3s through difficult terrain, but now they don't do anymore because they'd be too easy to spot. So it's mainly individuals or 2s, and the soldiers, they're very vulnerable. They try and get through the no man's land very quickly, but camouflage and try and hide from the drones. Most of them die. Then of the ones that get through, a few survive. Then they meet up at their chosen meeting point. But of course, they haven't got any tanks or artillery. They haven't got infantry fighting vehicles or anything. They've just got guns and grenades and things. And then they try and do as much as they can with those. And of course, as soon as the Ukrainians realise that there's, say, 5 or 10 soldiers roaming around trying to cause havoc, then they'll get their drones on them, finding them. And so it just doesn't last very long. And so that's the situation as it is now in Donetsk. And that's why it's kind of so static there. And so it's not clear. It's every few months the situation is a different kind of war. And probably 3 months from now it'll be different again. And it might reach the point where literally human beings can't cross the drone barrier. So we don't really know what's going to be happening in the future. So this is why both sides see it as being just, this is time to stop. We need to end this war. And so to some extent Putin must be aware of this and thinking, how long will I be able to actually do any advances for? So that's the background of the drones. So now imagine that the war has ended, and this is now a ceasefire line. So you're not actually fighting. Then both sides can produce more drones because they're not being shot down. And Ukraine can make millions a year, and they last for quite a long time flying back and forth because they have to replace them with a new one. And there'll be drones several to a metre all the way along the front line, patrolling back and forth, looking for any human being that tries to cross it. So that's what I was saying, and this doesn't seem to be much talked about, that this would make the front line much easier to enforce. And then, as I say, how could Ukraine do a counteroffensive? And that's why it seems very unlikely that they actually can. They can. I'll talk about the military psychological levers in a bit, but this is about the evolution. So in spring 2022, Ukraine didn't even detect the tanks hidden in the forest around Zaporizhia, and that can never happen now. And Russia didn't notice the Kharkiv Liberation Force practicing in the Kharkiv Oblast beneath the trees before the leaves fell from the trees. The leaves from the trees were enough to hide a liberation force from Russia. Russia built a minefield so wide that NATO standard demining measures couldn't cross it. You can go and look through this in detail. It's by 2024-5 that you started having the transparent battlefield becoming almost impenetrable, and then now that's in our situation now. So then if you look at these, how can we have a ceasefire? Then the ceasefire would very likely have, you typically have a demilitarized zone, but the front line normally would have soldiers there patrolling the front line, like that's what they do in the demilitarized zone with North Korea, and the soldiers patrolling back and forth. But now you have drones patrolling back and forth. Maybe they'll do that in Korea too soon. So and then further back from that, well, it's going to be much easier to withdraw from the front line now because there's hardly anyone there anyway, as compared to if you tried to do a ceasefire, say this time last year. Then there'd be lots of soldiers along the front line, just within shooting distance of each other. But now, no, it's just and it's empty. There's nobody there, hardly anyone there. And then you'd have the patrolling soldiers, but they'd be set well back, along with the artillery and the HIMARS and ATACMS. Before that, and beyond that, you get the air defences, and then you'd get the and some soldiers from the UK and France amongst the air defence to helping to man the air defences just for kind of solidarity. But the main thing, you'd have the air patrols by the Allied fighter jets. They'd be hundreds of kilometres from the front line, and then you'd have the sea patrols by the UK Navy. So this is after the war is ended, once you've got a ceasefire, and this would gradually, there'd be step-by-step process, so it wouldn't all happen at once. You'd have gradually both sides withdraw from the front line, both Russia and the Ukrainians, and then they'd have just the drones there and everyone else withdrawing. The artillery would then be removed away from the artillery zone, so they can't actually fire artillery to the other side. And it would just gradually be, and not short-range artillery anyway, they'd just gradually step back like that, and there'd be a phased withdrawal until there's very little, until you can hardly see anything on the ground at the front line. So that is how you would do a ceasefire, and we know how to do it, but it would be complicated by the drones, or rather simplified perhaps by the drones. So we know how to do a ceasefire, it's just slightly modified because of the drones. Now, so I talked about Putin's decision tree in the last one, and then I just want to talk here about military psychological levers, just very slightly. So this is something I talked about before. So, and I just want to say, I forgot to say, I'm not sure if I've got a bit about it in here, but the Ukraine's allies' fighter jets will be vastly superior to the Russian fighter jets, and there's no possibility of Russia catching up with NATO technology for its most modern fighter jets. So this means that if Ukraine had the most modern fighter jets, then it could take over the airspace of occupied Ukraine. And so tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, they are obsolete, but the fighter jets, they're not, or pretty much obsolete in the war. Nobody's using them on the front line anymore, hardly. But the fighter jets, and they still have a role to play. And if Ukraine had the F-35 fighter jets, then they would be able to take over the entire airspace of occupied Ukraine and surrounded areas of Russian border as well. Really, very quickly as Israel took over the airspace of Iran. And so this, it's not going to actually happen with Ukraine, but in the Ukraine war, but this helps to enforce the ceasefire, because once the ceasefire is over, once the ceasefire is in place, eventually over time, the Ukrainians will get the F-35s, and they'll be able to fly those, and then there's no way that Putin is going to start a war with Ukraine when it's got the F-35 fighter jets, and with a frontline patrol with drones. So I think that is probably the way it's eventually going to go. And then hopefully we get a peace dividend at the end of all that, because once they realise they just can't fight anymore, then what's the point in all this military equipment that they're spending so much on? So anyway, so that was all about this bit. So when we get, once you put into this peace array, then we've got the ceasefire zone, we've got the militarized zone, we can get it completely peaceful, and then I don't think the war's going to start up again after that. So, but I mean, we'll see. So the security guarantees are to ensure it won't start up again, and I think, I mean, if it's a short ceasefire, then maybe Russia would start up again, but actually it's soldiers trying to get across the line after Ukraine has had enough time to build vast numbers of drones, so they're just 1 or 2 every meter along the front line. Then at that point I think it'd be pretty impenetrable. So anyway, that's just my idea that I was throwing in. And then the other thing is, I just want to talk a little bit about the military psychological levers. And so this is the idea that if Ukraine now has its long Neptune, which is 1,000-kilometer range, and that's enough to reach all of the Black Sea from Ukraine-held territory. And Russia has its Black Sea fleet in the Black Sea, and it's incredibly vulnerable because it can't. The only way it could get out is through various canals to the Caspian Sea, but Ukraine has fire control over the Kerch Strait, and it would be able to sink ships that try to go through there if it wanted to. So it's a valid actual target in the war, because Russia uses them to launch missiles at Ukraine, and it could also be used as a negotiating tactic by Ukraine, and this would be valid because it's a valid military target. Then Ukraine could say to Putin, look, if you don't stop this fighting, then we will sink your Black Sea fleet. And so this would have not much military significance, but it would be of such prestige loss to Putin that is an example of a military psychological lever. So that might be another way that the war could be stopped by you. So I just want to mention that as well. That's another way, not necessarily this particular lever, but some form of psychological effect, where it's something effect on the prestige of Russia or something like that, which would be just so embarrassing to Russia that they can't stand it, and so they say, okay, we'll stop fighting. I can't see Ukraine actually getting Crimea back or getting the occupied regions back by using a military psychological lever, but they could stop the war perhaps by doing that. So that's just another thought. If nothing else works, then I bet that the Ukrainians do have this up their sleeves. Like they talk about, Zelensky always has cards up his sleeve somewhere or other. So I'm sure that they have other cards that they can play if the sanctions don't work, and I expect this is one of them. But they very clearly do want the ceasefire. I think Ukraine is utterly genuine that it doesn't see any possibility now of a counter-offensive. I don't think they're thinking that those ways anymore. I would be very astonished if I were to hear, just because of the change of the technology in the last few weeks, I'd be very surprised if they do have plans for a counter-offensive anymore. Because I just, from the people I follow, apart from if they were to get an overwhelming advantage in the air, I don't see how that's possible. And they can't do it by stopping logistics, because drones is just so low cost and easy to transport. So, and it isn't safe to do a counter-offensive as long as the drones, unless they had a way to kind of a new way of destroying Russian drones en masse in some massive, fantastical way that nobody thought of, or to it just doesn't seem very likely that they have any plans for counter-offensive anymore. So what's Russia's aim, Ukraine, and then just say, so what is Ukraine's aim going to be? And then let's talk about how we don't risk world war from any of this. So what is Ukraine's aim? What Ukraine can realistically do? Then they can use the economic levers, the military psychological levers, and so on, to get an agreement according to which will ensure that the Ukrainians have been imprisoned just for not being Russian and for singing the Ukrainian national anthem and so on, that they'd be released. And also forcefully adopted Ukrainian kids, and get more reparations. Well, they very likely will get the 300 billion Russian foreign reserves. Probably that would be part of the agreement, and it'd be very difficult to Russia to argue against that. If Ukraine is arguing for a position of strength, then I think the Russians have probably pretty much written off their foreign reserves already. And then we'd end up in a situation where there is a ceasefire. Either there's a ceasefire, there may be a peace agreement, there may be territory swaps. So, yes, just briefly mention that I think if I go forward, territory swaps. Yeah, there we are, territory swaps. Then this is an example. So I talked about that fortress belt there. Now, suppose that they did agree to a territory swap, then they would have to swap that for something equally important to Russia. So if Ukraine was to give away the fortress belt, that is extremely, make them extremely vulnerable here. Well, they would want something like Melitopol back, which would make Russia extremely vulnerable here. And that would be a like-for-like exchange. So that's not impossible, but remember that's only possible after a referendum. And there might be many different opinions amongst the depending on what the swap is and what they're swapping for what, then there might be many different opinions amongst Ukrainian people as to whether they can accept that or not. So, anyway, and I was talking about Crimea in one of my videos. Look, see, Crimea is really prime real estate, as Trump has said, and the Azov Sea coast, and so and so you could see it appeal to oligarchs. And then as for Donetsk, then that's not so much prime real estate as that it's got lots and lots of minerals and things and various resources that they could use. So that is a matter of it's some interest to oligarchs too. So anyway, so that was about the possibly a like-for-like swap, and that would not happen straight away. So what would happen? Suppose we have a ceasefire, then first of all it would just be a ceasefire along the existing line. They'd smooth out some of the wrinkles a little bit, and that would be it. That would be all that Putin, that Zelensky, as president, has the authority to do. He'd just say we're going to stop fighting, and then they'd set up this, what I just described, the kind of drone corridor, whatever it is, and they'd withdraw from it from either side, very much like the militarized zone in North Korea, between North and South Korea. There'd be fences between the two, and the people would be able to drive back and forth between the two. It wouldn't be like North Korea, because Russia isn't as close off from Ukraine as North Korea is from South Korea. So people would be able to drive across in between the two places. But there'd be very drones going back and forth, patrolling it all the time, just making sure that no soldiers, no tanks, nothing military is crossing it in any way. And of course, all the missile strikes in the air would stop. So that would be the ceasefire. Then that ceasefire, and then they would have this negotiations. During negotiations, they might agree a swap, like for instance, that for that, or that for that. And so then that would then go to a referendum, which would be at the earliest May, June 2026. That's about the earliest they could feasibly do it. And then if the referendum said yes to that in Ukraine, and it would do on Putin's side because he can just rig any referendum that he does. So they would then agree, if Putin wants it, then he'll get it. And then on the Ukrainian side, it depends on the campaign and whether they agree or not. Then if they agree, then the inhabitants of Kramatorsk, or whatever you say it, then they would have to decide, do we want to stay here and be part of Russia, or do we want to move out? So some of them would move out, some would stay. And the line would be drawn around there, and then the line would be drawn around here, and be a similar decision for any Russians that are in that area, whether they want to stay and become part of Ukraine, or whether they want to move. And then it would just be done in a controlled, careful way, bit by bit, after the referendum. So that is how a peace treaty would be done, the only way it can be done. And it could involve some land swapping. And the land would not be ceded. They wouldn't sign a piece of law in the Ukrainian constitution saying this land is part of Russia. That's extremely unlikely that they could get a referendum for that. But they would just sign a law saying we will not fight. We will not try to take any of this land back by fighting. So they could pass a law in Ukrainian parliament saying we are not going to fight Russia along that front line. And so that's the way it would work. And then they keep the claim, but they wouldn't actually try to enforce it. So and then they would hope, and then you get very much like North Korea and South Korea, the Ukrainians here and some Ukrainians here and here, they might yearn for a unified Ukraine, and then they just hope for it, but they wouldn't actually be able to do anything about it. And it would continue like that for as long as Putin is president, at least. So that's the way the war might end. And then either that, or the worst case, as I said, is a frozen conflict, which it just continues. They just low-level shelling back and forth. Eventually, they get tired of fighting at each other. Occasional things lobbed across from one side to another, and they just stop fighting because they get tired of it and they're not achieving anything. And then maybe the missile strikes so gradually get less and less as well, and Russia just stops attacking Ukrainian cities because what's the point? And so that's the other way that it could end. It could just peter out after maybe several years. So that's the worst case. So hopefully now that you can see that the worst case isn't something for anyone outside Ukraine to be affected by at all. But it's something, of course, they very much prefer a proper agreement. So hopefully that helps you to be much less scared about all this. So yeah, so that's the worst case. I'd actually talked about that before, brought it all together in this video. So I'll upload this, and in the video, go to click in video description, you can find this, look for the sections that I found, and you can find out more about all this. So again, I hope this helps you be a bit less scared about all this and start thinking. And then we really, things do look pretty positive, I think, but please do not assume it's going to be positive. Hope it's positive, be glad if it is positive, think that it's good that they are actually talking about things like this. But please don't assume that on some particular day that the ceasefire, even if they announce the ceasefire is going to start on a particular day, there's always a possibility that Russia breaks it on day 1 or day 2 or whatever. And always, if there is an announced ceasefire, there always will be breaches of the ceasefire on the first day. That always happens. But it might then gradually, over a period of several days, then it becomes clear whether it's going to stick or not. And then after that, then people get more and more confident that this is a genuine ceasefire. So anyway, let's hope that happens, but let's not assume it. Please don't assume it. But great to hope it. And I very much hope it does happen and happens very quickly.